What happens when the world's most disciplined military machine dismisses a technological leap as impossible, only to watch their cities vanish under bombs they never saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 8th, 1944. Somewhere deep within a concrete bunker beneath the Harz Mountains, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic taste of desperation. At a steel table cluttered with maps, reports, and half-empty coffee cups sat General Friedrich Wolf, chief of the Luftwaffe's Intelligence Directorate for the Western Front. In his weathered hands, he held the folder marked Streng Geheim, Top Secret. Inside were 3 typed pages that, if accurate, meant Germany's air defense doctrine had become obsolete overnight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The report came from a Luftwaffe liaison officer stationed with Japanese forces in the Pacific. It described something that sounded like science fiction. American bombers, massive 4-engined fortresses called B-29 super fortresses, dropping bombs from altitude so high that German fighters couldn't reach them. But that wasn't the truly terrifying part. The report claimed these bombs weren't falling randomly. They were being guided by radar, through clouds, through darkness, through conditions where human eyes were useless. Wolf read the technical specifications again, his jaw tightening with each line. Operational ceiling, 9,000 meters. Bomb load, 9,000 kilograms. Range, 5,200 kilometers. And then the phrase that made his blood run cold. Radar-guided bomb release system allows precision strikes regardless of visibility. To most of Wolf's colleagues in the Wehrmacht's high command, this report would have seemed laughable. Radar-guided bombs dropped from 9 kilometers up? The Allies couldn't possibly have developed such technology. German engineers were the best in the world. Everyone knew that. If such a system were feasible, German scientists would have built it first. This was the gospel preached in every briefing room from Berlin to Munich. But Wolf was different. He was a man who had learned the hard way that underestimating your enemy was the fastest path to the grave. He had watched the Luftwaffe's invincibility crumble over Britain in 1940. He had seen Germany's unstoppable tanks frozen in the Russian winter. He had witnessed the Reich's industrial might buried under waves of Allied bombers that, according to propaganda, shouldn't have existed in such numbers. Now, holding this folder, Wolf understood he was looking at the next chapter in Germany's long education in humility. The problem was convincing anyone else. The intelligence had arrived piecemeal over the previous 6 months, like fragments of a puzzle scattered across the globe. The first hint came from a Kriegsmarine U-boat commander operating off the Mariana Islands. His report mentioned seeing B-29s flying at impossible altitudes before strikes on Japanese positions. The submarine's crew had watched through periscopes as bombs fell with eerie precision despite heavy cloud cover. Then came reports from German military attachés in neutral Sweden who had interviewed Finnish officers. The Finns, fighting their own desperate war against the Soviets, had intelligence sharing agreements with Germany. They reported that American technical journals, carefully monitored by Swedish intermediaries, were publishing papers on microwave radar systems and high-altitude bombing computers. The articles were heavily redacted, but the implications were clear. The Americans were solving the problem of blind bombing. A German agent in Switzerland managed to photograph a technical manual that had somehow made its way from a crashed B-29 in China to the black market in Zurich. The manual's diagrams showed something called the AN/APQ-13 radar system, a device that could see the ground through clouds and guide bombardiers to their targets with shocking accuracy. Each piece of intelligence, viewed alone, could be dismissed. Perhaps the U-boat commander had misjudged the altitude. Perhaps the Swedish reports were Allied disinformation. Perhaps the manual was a fake planted to mislead German intelligence. But when Wolf's analysts assembled all the fragments together, a terrifying picture emerged. The Americans hadn't just built a better bomber. They had created an entirely new kind of warfare, one where Germany's advantages in fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft guns became irrelevant. You couldn't shoot down what you couldn't reach. You couldn't intercept what you couldn't see coming. The implications cascaded through Wolf's mind like falling dominoes. Germany's industrial centers, already battered by years of strategic bombing, would become sitting targets. The Ruhr Valley's steel mills, the synthetic oil plants that kept the Wehrmacht's tanks moving, the ball-bearing factories that kept machines running, the rocket production facilities at Peenemünde. All of them could be destroyed with mathematical precision, regardless of weather, regardless of smokescreens, regardless of the desperate fighter defenses Germany could muster. Worse still, Germany had no answer. The Luftwaffe's best interceptor, the Me-262 jet fighter, could reach 12,000 meters in theory, but only for brief periods. Its engines, temperamental and fuel-hungry, couldn't sustain high-altitude combat. The aging Bf-109s and FW-190s that formed the backbone of Germany's fighter force were already struggling against the Allied escort fighters at 7,000 meters. Against bombers cruising at 9,000 meters with radar-guided bombs? They might as well have been throwing rocks.
And yet, when Wolf tried to raise the alarm, he encountered the same wall that had frustrated countless German officers before him. The Reich's leadership lived in a fantasy world where German technological superiority was an article of faith, not a hypothesis to be tested. He scheduled a briefing with General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, commander of Luftflotte Reich, the air fleet responsible for defending German airspace. Wolf arrived with charts, photographs, and carefully prepared arguments. He explained the intelligence sources. He outlined the technical capabilities of the B-29 and its radar systems. He presented calculations showing that Germany's current defenses couldn't touch these bombers.
Stumpf listened with growing impatience, his fingers drumming on the desk. When Wolf finished, the General Oberst leaned back in his chair and laughed. Not a warm laugh, but the harsh bark of a man who believed he'd just wasted 30 minutes on nonsense. "Radar-guided bombs?" Stumpf scoffed. "From 9 kilometers? Wolf, have you been drinking? The Americans are good at propaganda, I'll give them that. They've convinced you they've achieved what our finest scientists say is impossible. Sir, the evidence—" "Evidence? You have reports from a submarine commander who probably couldn't tell 6,000 meters from 9,000. You have Swedish rumors and black market manuals that could have been forged by Allied intelligence specifically to make us waste resources chasing phantoms." Stumpf stood, signaling the meeting was over. "The Americans have heavy bombers, yes. We've dealt with them before. Our flak can reach high enough. Our fighters are being upgraded. We are not," he emphasized each word, "going to panic because of some exaggerated reports from the PacificTheater." Wolf tried again. "Sir, if even half of what these reports suggest is true, then we'll deal with it when we see it," Stumpf interrupted. "Until then, I have real problems to address." Dismissed. As Wolf walked back through the bunker's concrete corridors, he felt a familiar despair settling over him. This was how it always went in the Reich. Facts were negotiable. Belief was mandatory. The Führer had promised that German will and German genius would prevail, and therefore it must be true. Anyone who suggested otherwise wasn't presenting intelligence. They were spreading defeatism. But Wolf had one more card to play. He requested a meeting with Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring himself, the commander of the entire Luftwaffe. Getting the appointment took 3 weeks of bureaucratic maneuvering, but finally, Wolf found himself in Göring's opulent office.
a jarring contrast of velvet curtains and Renaissance paintings while the Reich crumbled outside. Goering sat behind his desk like a Baroque monarch, medals covering his chest, his face flushed from the morphine addiction everyone knew about but no one discussed. Wolf presented his case once more, this time even more carefully, using language designed to stroke Goering's ego while delivering the warning. Reichsmarschall, I bring this to your attention because only you have the vision to understand the threat and the authority to prepare our defenses. Goering waved a jeweled hand dismissively. General Wolf, I appreciate your diligence, truly, but you must understand something about the Americans. They are excellent manufacturers, tractors, automobiles, refrigerators, but precision warfare, strategic thinking? These require a kind of military genius that democratic societies simply cannot produce. They lack the discipline, the racial cohesion, Sir, with respect, the British said the same thing about us in 1939. The room went silent. Goering's face darkened. For a moment, Wolf thought he'd gone too far. Then Goering smiled, but it was the smile of a predator. General, I think you've been reading too many intelligence reports and not spending enough time with our troops. Talk to our fighter pilots. Talk to our flak crews. They'll tell you, we own the skies over the Reich. Let the Americans try their wonder weapons. We've heard these stories before. Secret rockets, invisible bombers, death rays. Where are they? I'll tell you where they are. In the imaginations of Allied propaganda offices. Goering stood, his massive frame intimidating despite the obvious physical decline. Return to your duties, General, and perhaps take a few days' leave. Clear your head. You seem stressed. It was a dismissal and a warning rolled into one. Wolf recognized the signs. He was being marked as unreliable, possibly defeatist. In the paranoid world of late-war Nazi Germany, such labels could be fatal. As Wolf left Goering's office, he understood with brutal clarity what was about to happen. The intelligence was solid, the threat was real, and Germany's leadership had chosen to ignore it, just as they had ignored every other inconvenient truth that contradicted their ideology.
The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. The very traits the Nazi leadership mocked, American pragmatism, their mongrel diversity, their industrial capitalism, were being weaponized into systems that German racial theory couldn't account for. How could the master race be out-engineered by a democracy? How could German military genius be outthought by American factory workers? The questions themselves were heretical in the Reich. But while Berlin's generals laughed and Goering sneered, something remarkable was happening on the other side of the world. In the vast Pacific Theater, American engineers and scientists were proving that the impossible was merely difficult, and they had already solved it. The story of the B-29 superfortress and its radar-guided bombing system didn't begin in a laboratory or a drafting room. It began with a problem that had plagued strategic bombing since its inception. You can't hit what you can't see. In the early years of World War II, bomber crews faced a simple but devastating reality. To drop bombs accurately, they needed visual confirmation of their target. But weather, smoke, darkness, and enemy defenses often made visual bombing impossible or suicidal. The British had learned this painfully during their nighttime raids on Germany. Studies showed that only a fraction of bombs were landing within 5 miles of their intended targets. The Americans, characteristically, approached this as an engineering problem to be solved. If human eyes couldn't pierce clouds and darkness, then perhaps electromagnetic radiation could. Radar technology, initially developed for detecting aircraft, could theoretically be adapted to see the ground below. The challenge was monumental. Ground mapping radar had to distinguish between urban targets and countryside, between factories and farms, all while bouncing signals off the Earth from altitudes of 30,000 feet. The radar returns were fuzzy, ambiguous, requiring trained operators to interpret the ghostly images on cathode ray tubes. But the Americans poured resources into the problem: money, scientists, engineers, test aircraft. By 1944, they had created the AN-APQ-13 radar system. It wasn't perfect. The images were crude by modern standards, near blobs of light and shadow on a screen. But trained radar operators could identify coastlines, rivers, cities, and major industrial complexes. Combined with sophisticated computing mechanisms, analog computers that calculated wind speed, altitude, bomb ballistics, and drift, the system could guide bombs to targets the bombardier had never seen with his eyes.
And they mounted this system in the B-29 Superfortress, an aircraft that was itself a technological marvel. The B-29 wasn't just bigger than previous bombers, it was fundamentally different. Pressurized cabin so crews could breathe at extreme altitudes. Remotely controlled gun turrets operated by sophisticated computer systems. Engines powerful enough to lift massive bomb loads to heights where German interceptors gasped for air. The first B-29s entered combat in the Pacific Theater in June 1944, striking Japanese targets from bases in China and the Mariana Islands. Japanese defenders quickly learned what German intelligence analysts were trying to tell their superiors. These weren't just improved bombers. They were a different class of weapon entirely.
Reports from the Pacific filtered back through intelligence channels. A raid on the Iwata steelworks in Japan. Bombs falling through thick cloud cover, hitting the target with precision that should have been impossible. An attack on aircraft factories near Tokyo. The B-29s flying so high that Japanese fighters could barely reach them, and when they did, they were too oxygen-deprived and fuel-starved to press effective attacks. The math was brutal. A Japanese pilot in a Ki-84 Hayate, one of their best fighters, could theoretically reach 10,000 meters. But at that altitude, his engine was gasping, his controls were mushy, his ammunition was limited by weight restrictions. Meanwhile, the B-29s cruised comfortably at 9,000 meters, their crews warm and pressurized, their defensive guns computer-aimed and deadly accurate. It was a preview of what awaited Germany if the B-29s ever turned their attention to Europe. But in Berlin, this future was still dismissed as Allied fantasy.
General Wolf, isolated and increasingly desperate, continued to compile reports. He documented every scrap of intelligence about the B-29 program. He noted that American industrial capacity was producing these superfortresses at a rate that would have seemed impossible just years before. Boeing's plants in Wichita, Kansas, and Renton, Washington were churning out B-29s like automobiles, while subsidiary plants produced components in a vast network of American manufacturing might. Wolf's analysts calculated the implications. If even a fraction of the B-29 fleet deployed to the Pacific were redirected to Europe, if the Americans decided the German industry needed the same treatment as Japanese factories, if these radar-guided bombs proved as effective as the reports suggested, the conclusion was unavoidable. Germany's war production, already strained to the breaking point by conventional strategic bombing, would collapse entirely. The synthetic oil plants that kept the Wehrmacht mobile, the ball-bearing factories that kept machines running, the aircraft assembly plants struggling to replace losses, all of them would be destroyed with methodical precision, regardless of weather, regardless of smoke screens, regardless of the desperate sacrifices of German fighter pilots.
Wolf prepared one final report. He stripped away the technical jargon and the defensive language. He wrote it in stark, simple terms that even the most ideologically blinded general would understand. The enemy possesses technological capabilities that render our current air defense doctrine obsolete. If we do not adapt immediately,
We will lose the industrial capacity to continue the war within 6 months. He submitted the report through official channels, knowing it would likely be filed and forgotten. But he also made copies and quietly distributed them to junior officers, to factory managers, to anyone who might listen. If the top leadership wouldn't act, perhaps someone lower down the chain would prepare for what was coming. Because Wolf knew, with the certainty of a man who had watched every one of Germany's supposed advantages crumble, that the Americans weren't bluffing. The B-29s were real, the radar-guided bombs were real, and sooner or later they would come. The only question was whether anyone in Germany would be ready when they did.
As 1944 turned to 1945, the pieces were all in place. On one side, American crews were perfecting their radar bombing techniques over Japan, learning the quirks of the AN/APQ-13 system, training for the systematic destruction of industrial targets. On the other side, German generals assured themselves that their flak guns and fighter planes would be sufficient, that American technical prowess was exaggerated, that the Reich's industrial heartland was secure. In his bunker in the Harz Mountains, General Friedrich Wolf sat at his steel table, looking at the growing stack of ignored reports. He had done everything an intelligence officer could do. He had gathered the evidence. He had presented the warnings. He had tried to pierce the bubble of delusion that surrounded Germany's leadership. But in the Third Reich, truth was treason. And the price of being right was often higher than the price of being wrong. The stage was set. The weapons were ready. The intelligence had been delivered and dismissed. All that remained was for history to deliver its verdict, written not in words, but in the roar of Wright R-3350 engines at 30,000 feet, carrying bombs that could see through darkness and clouds to find their targets with mathematical certainty. The Wehrmacht never knew what was coming, but they were about to learn. The winter of 1945 arrived with a savage cold that seemed to mirror Germany's collapsing fortunes. In the frozen corridors of power, where denial had become doctrine, the first cracks in the facade were beginning to show. Not through confession or revelation, but through the brutal arithmetic of destruction raining from skies the Wehrmacht could no longer defend. General Friedrich Wolf had stopped trying to convince his superiors. There was no point anymore. Instead, he spent his days in the Harz Mountains bunker, cataloging the evidence of his prophecy coming true, knowing that each report he filed would join the others in some forgotten archive. The vindication he felt was hollow, bitter as ash. The change began subtly. Luftwaffe pilots, returning from encounters with high-altitude raiders, started filing unusual after-action reports. They described bombers, clearly American, clearly B-29s based on the silhouettes, flying at altitudes their fighters couldn't effectively reach. But it was the bombing patterns that disturbed the pilots most. Factories were being hit with precision that shouldn't have been possible given the weather conditions. One report, filed by Hauptmann Klaus Richter, a veteran fighter ace with 32 kills, caught Wolf's attention. Richter had intercepted a formation of B-29s approaching the Luna synthetic oil facility near Leipzig. The weather was atrocious. Thick cloud cover from 2,000 meters all the way up to 7,000 meters. The bombers were cruising at 8,500 meters, well above the clouds. Richter's report was clinical, but couldn't hide his bewilderment. We attempted intercept at maximum altitude. My FW-190D9 struggled to reach 8,000 meters. Engine performance degraded severely. Control response sluggish. Managed brief firing pass, no observable hits. Enemy formation maintained course and altitude, completely undisturbed by our presence. Bombs released while still above cloud cover. No visual contact with target possible from that altitude. Post-raid reconnaissance shows direct hits on main processing powers and storage facilities. Precision impossible under those conditions with conventional bombing methods.
Request explanation of enemy capability. There was no explanation Wolf could give that wouldn't sound like defeatist propaganda. How could he tell this decorated pilot that the Americans had simply solved a problem German engineers had declared unsolvable? That while the Reich's leadership had laughed at intelligence reports, American scientists had turned radar into a targeting system that rendered weather irrelevant. The raids intensified. The synthetic oil plant at Politz was hit on a day when visibility was less than 100 meters at ground level. The Buna rubber works at Chopau was struck through solid cloud cover. The hydrogenation plant at Brooks took devastating damage despite smokescreens and weather that grounded all Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights. Each time, the pattern was the same. B-29s approaching at extreme altitude, 8,000 to 9,500 meters. Cloud cover making visual bombing impossible. Bombs falling with precision that suggested the bombardiers could see through the clouds. And they could, in a way. Their AN/APQ-13 radar scopes showed them ghostly green images of the landscape below, translated into targeting data by analog computers that German engineers would have considered witchcraft. In early February 1945, Wolf received a report that made his hands shake as he read it. A formation of 12 B-29s had struck the underground aircraft factory at Kala, deep in the Thuringian countryside. The facility had been built into mountain tunnels specifically to protect it from conventional bombing. It was invisible from the air, camouflaged by forest and terrain. Visual bombing would have required impossible luck to find the hidden entrances. The B-29s had found them anyway. Bombs had collapsed tunnel entrances, destroyed ventilation systems, and buried manufacturing equipment under tons of rock. Over 200 workers were trapped inside. The facility, which had cost millions of Reichsmarks and months of forced labor to construct, was rendered useless in a single 20-minute raid. The report included a note from the facility's security officer. No reconnaissance aircraft observed in area for 3 weeks prior to raid. Weather conditions on day of attack: complete overcast, ceiling 800 meters. Enemy bombers never visible from ground. Bombing accuracy suggests detailed knowledge of facility layout impossible to obtain through visual observation. Request investigation of security breach or espionage. There was no security breach. There was no spy network that had provided the Americans with blueprints. There was only radar, mathematics, and the kind of technological pragmatism that Nazi ideology had convinced itself couldn't exist in a mongrel democracy. Wolf tried one more time. He requested a meeting with General Lieutenant Joseph Schmid, who had taken over much of the Luftwaffe's operational planning as Goering descended further into irrelevance and addiction. Schmid was known as a realist, a professional soldier who dealt in facts rather than ideology. They met in a requisitioned hotel in Weimar, surrounded by officers who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Schmidt listened to Wolf's briefing without interruption, studying the photographs and damage reports spread across the table. "How certain are you about the radar-guided bombs?" Schmidt asked quietly. "As certain as I can be without capturing the equipment intact," Wolf replied. "Every indicator points to the same conclusion. They're using microwave radar to map the ground through clouds. The technology isn't theoretical. It's operational, proven, and they're using it to destroy our industrial capacity with surgical precision." Schmid stared at the photographs for a long moment. "Can we counter it?" "Not with current capabilities. Our fighters can't reach them effectively. Our flak can barely touch them at those altitudes. We have no radar jammers that operate on the frequencies they're using. We don't even know what frequencies they're using. And they're destroying our fuel production, which means even if we had better interceptors, we couldn't fly them. What do you recommend?" Wolf almost laughed. Recommendations? What could he recommend now with the Reich disintegrating? Disperse production. Go underground deeper. Harden facilities. Accept that we cannot stop these raids and focus on minimizing damage. And he hesitated,
knowing how dangerous the next words were. Prepare for the reality that we're fighting a war we cannot win through military means. Schmidt's face hardened. That last part stays between us, General. I agree with your assessment, but there are those who would consider such words treasonous. The truth has been treasonous for years, Wolf said quietly. That's why we're in this position.
Within days of that meeting, the tempo of B-29 raids increased. American planners had identified Germany's critical bottlenecks: fuel production, ball bearings, transportation hubs, and the superfortresses were methodically destroying them. Each raid demonstrated the same impossible precision, bombs falling through weather that should have made accurate bombing impossible. Targets hit on the first pass with no need for follow-up raids. German workers in the targeted facilities began to understand what their leaders refused to acknowledge. In the underground factories and camouflaged plants, rumors spread. The Americans had a secret weapon. They could see through clouds. They could guide bombs with invisible rays. The explanations varied, growing more fantastical with each retelling, but the core truth remained: nowhere was safe anymore. The psychological impact was devastating. German industrial workers had endured years of conventional bombing. They had learned to cope with the terror of air raids, the randomness of blast and shrapnel. But this was different. This was impersonal, mathematical, inescapable. You couldn't hide from bombs that found you, regardless of weather, camouflage, or defensive measures. Production rates plummeted, not just from physical damage, but from absenteeism and psychological breakdown. Workers stopped believing in protective measures. Why rush to shelters when the bombs would find their targets anyway? Why repair damaged equipment when another raid would destroy it with the same precision? The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots faced their own crisis of morale. They were brave men, many of them veterans of years of combat. But bravery meant nothing when you couldn't reach the enemy. Pilots pushed their aircraft to mechanical failure, trying to intercept the high-flying B-29s. Engines seized from overheating. Oxygen systems failed. Controls froze at extreme altitudes. Hauptmann Richter, the ace who had filed that prescient report, was killed in late February attempting to intercept a B-29 formation over Dresden. His FW-190 suffered engine failure at 8,200 meters, probably from fuel starvation or extreme cold. He managed to bail out, but died from hypoxia before reaching breathable air. His last radio transmission, recovered from flight recorders, was simple: "Can't reach them. Nobody can reach them." The Americans, meanwhile, were refining their techniques. Radar operators became more skilled at reading the ghostly images on their scopes. Bombardiers learned to correlate radar returns with target folders prepared by photo reconnaissance. The AN/APQ-13 system's limitations, its difficulty in distinguishing between similar structures, its reduced effectiveness over water, were documented and compensated for through better mission planning and operator training. By March 1945, the systematic destruction of Germany's industrial capacity was nearly complete. The synthetic oil plants that had kept the Wehrmacht mobile were smoking ruins. Ball bearing production had dropped to a fraction of pre-raid levels. Aircraft factories were operating at perhaps 20% capacity, and even that production couldn't be sustained without fuel and raw materials. German forces in the field felt the impact immediately. Panzer divisions received fuel allocations measured in liters rather than tons. Luftwaffe squadrons were grounded not from lack of aircraft, but from lack of fuel to fly them. Artillery units conserved ammunition because the transportation network, shattered by precision bombing, couldn't deliver fresh supplies. He submitted this report not through military channels, but through a contact in the Foreign Ministry, who he hoped would preserve it for historical record. He titled it simply, "The Price of Disbelief, an analysis of intelligence failure and technological denial in the defense of the Reich." The report included a final section that read, "This catastrophe was preventable, not through military action, which may have been impossible given the technological gap, but through honest assessment and realistic planning. Had the warnings been heeded in 1943, dispersal of industry, hardening of facilities, and resource allocation might have mitigated the damage. Instead, ideology triumphed over intelligence, and wishful thinking replaced strategic planning. The lesson for future military establishments is clear. The greatest threat to national security is not always the enemy's capabilities, but your own willingness to ignore them. The document never reached Hitler or what remained of the High Command. By the time Wolf finalized it, the Reich's leadership was fragmenting into competing factions, each more concerned with survival than with learning lessons from failure.
Meanwhile, in the skies above Germany, the B-29 crews continued their methodical work. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't engage in dramatic dogfights or make daring attacks. They simply flew their assigned missions, watched their radar scopes, released their bombs when the computers told them to, and flew home. The destruction they caused was industrial, systematic, almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. One B-29 radar operator, a 22-year-old from Ohio named Thomas Brennan, kept a diary of his missions. His entries were matter-of-fact, describing the technical challenges of radar bombing without any sense of triumph or glory. March 12, 1945. Mission to Ruland. Complete overcast as expected, radar return clear on scope, River Junction made good initial point. Computer adjusted for 40-knot crosswind. Bombs away at 0847 hours. No enemy fighter contact. Some flak at altitude but inaccurate. Post-raid photos showed good concentration on target area. Synthetic oil production facility presumably destroyed or damaged. Crew fatigue moderate. Equipment performed within specifications. That clinical entry described the destruction of a facility that had taken 3 years to build and employed 4,000 workers. It represented millions of Reichsmarks investment and was a critical node in Germany's fuel network. And it was destroyed in a single mission by men who never saw the target with their own eyes. This was the new reality of warfare, and Germany's leadership had been too blinded by ideology to prepare for it. They had believed their own propaganda about technological superiority and racial destiny, right up until the moment when those beliefs collided with the mathematical certainty of radar-guided bombs falling from unreachable altitudes. By April 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east and Allied armies advanced from the west, the strategic bombing campaign was effectively over. Not because it had been stopped, but because there were no significant targets left to destroy. Germany's industrial capacity, the engine that had powered its military ambitions, had been systematically dismantled by bombers flying so high they were barely visible, using technology that the Reich's leadership had convinced itself couldn't exist. The final, bitter truth was written not in reports or intelligence assessments, but in the silence of factories that would never run again, in the empty fuel tanks of grounded aircraft, in the darkness of cities whose power stations had been reduced to rubble by bombs that fell through clouds like the hand of an impersonal god. The Wehrmacht had never known what was coming. By the time they understood, it was far too late to matter. The war had been lost not in dramatic battles or heroic last stands, but in the quiet certainty of technological superiority applied with mathematical precision. The empire that had mocked American industrial capability and dismissed radar-guided bombing as impossible had learned, in the hardest way possible, that arrogance is no defense against reality. And in his bunker in the Harz Mountains, General Friedrich Wolf sat among his ignored reports and vindicated predictions, a man who had seen the truth clearly and paid for that clarity with isolation, mockery, and the bitter knowledge that being right meant nothing when no one was willing to listen. The lesson was written in smoke and steel, in the mathematical precision of destruction that came from altitudes the Wehrmacht could never reach. Truth, when ignored, doesn't disappear. It simply arrives later, carried on the wings of consequences that no amount of ideology can deny.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.